Abortion and gay marriage are simple issues to respond to, but not really. They're actually very complex. In the context of the way we look at these particular issues, they're closely connected. But neither side of either issue makes any sense. They're actually just like all the others that come from our Democratic and Republican friends. They're spun in such a way as to distract the American people and take up space on front-page newspapers where real issues should be posted. Our government isn't supposed to work for big corporations, religious interests, or Freemasons. I say Freemasons because the necktie has a Masonic background where it represents a noose that's used in the initiation of a new Mason. The United States was founded by Masons, while the necktie is worn worldwide as a universal symbol of what? If it doesn't symbolize fealty to Freemasonry, but is a symbol of Freemasonry, then what is it? I don't think most of the people who wear them have any idea. They just wear them. I, however, don't. Not at least without knowing why I'm wearing one if I am not a Mason and have no intention of becoming or pretending to be a Mason. And even then, since the thyroid, a very important and sensitive gland that regulates hormones, is right where the necktie is tightened to symbolize a Freemason noose strangling the neck of a new initiate if Mason secrets are ever divulged, I still wouldn't wear one, unless of course it could be shown to have some positive benefit for the thyroid, which I doubt very seriously. The U.S. wasn't born to be a capitalist nation, a Christian nation, or a Freemason nation. Not that we're being told about openly anyway. Until we are, I'll assume that we're not, and that those who wear ties don't really know why they do it. Our forefathers gave birth to a nation whose government was supposed to be free from all these influences while securing plenty of room for us to figure out the answers to questions the government now considers its domain. Of course, we are as guilty of allowing this to happen as they are for creating this hapless environment. We're a democracy. We have the freedom to solve our own problems rather than passing them to politicians. We seem to have forgotten it, but it doesn't mean we can't remember it again. The root of the American Revolution didn't sprout from the Boston Tea Party. It wasn't a tax on tea that got Americans stirred up enough to risk their lives and future for something better. But before the Boston Tea Party, with the world's economies managed much the same as they are now, whenever the people at the top overextended themselves, spending wealth created by working people, they had to rein in the kingdom's gold and silver to pay off their debts so they could get more credit. Since America was so rich in natural resources, it wasn't dependent on the king's gold to survive like they were back in England. They were rather dependent on us sending them our spoils that were taken from the land here for free. When they lacked cash, they ran out of products to trade even as we still had the ability to keep producing. So while Britain was starving because they relied so heavily on imports, the 13 colonies were thriving by printing paper that was lent out with little or no interest, or simply spent by local governments directly into the economy. This paper was called colonial scrip, which created a booming British economy on this side of the Atlantic while London faltered for lack of coin. When Ben Franklin was called back to England to answer for how this was happening, the truth led to the removal of paper by new laws that requiring British taxes to be paid in gold or silver. This made it too confusing to use colonial scrip because it was too difficult to come up with different exchange rates for gold and silver and gold for the 13 different colonial scrips. This left a bad taste in America's mouths for their British overlords, while the sweet memory of freedom that had been planted in their minds that led to a yearning for an excuse to break away from the king and go back to printing their own paper. The tax on tea gave it to them. Later complications and buying a navy after the revolution was one led to our newly formed government going into debt to the same banking system they had inadvertently fought the war to free themselves from. So our nation wasn't founded as a capitalist country, but as an experiment in how a governing body that is not corrupt can manage the flow of products and services to and from working people with paper without taxing them through interest on speculative loans and actual taxes to run the government. Paper is the way we're heading now because it's the only way we can get the economy under control, by removing the middlemen who steal everything of value we produce while leaving the crumbs for us to fight over. Nebraska has the only state-owned bank in the country, while their economy hasn't been affected by what the rest of the country is going through since the economy crashed. But you don't hear the Democrats or Republicans talking about it because they support either bankers controlling our future or big government. This is how all issues are squared by the two parties. which both get money from the people benefiting from whatever way we get used. Every issue is framed the same way, spun so far from a reality that talking about it won't threaten the way it's used in the grand scheme to con us out of everything of value we can produce. But it has to be close enough to some kind of reality to make us think it's important enough to waste an electoral process talking about it. That's why they choose issues that we take personally, even though they have nothing to do with what our government is supposed to do. Because it's easier to allow ourselves to be drawn into social crossfire arguing about issues that passionately divide us. I mean, if you came from a big family where your parents were constantly pitting you against your siblings over issues that they had no business sticking their nose into, you'd eventually figure out they get some kind of sick reward out of messing with your heads. That's why we don't hear a lot about abortion or gay marriage anymore. So all we hear about now is rhetoric. Take, for instance, the serious side to discussing gay marriage. The question comes down to the legitimacy of sexuality, where heterosexuals believe their brand of sex is exceptionally relevant to society, while homosexual sexuality is only marginally or totally irrelevant, or even wrong and totally immoral. But who's asking about the legitimacy of sexuality in the first place? I mean, wild animals don't have sex. They go into heat during prime mating seasons when their offspring will have the best chance of survival when they are born. In ancient European times, there were spring fertility orgies that provided for a high birth rate in early February. That way, newly born babies were beginning to be weaned from their mother's milk in early spring, when it would be easiest to begin feeding an extra mouth through its first year being alive. This evolved from our heritage being wild animals who didn't have any kind of sexuality. We only went into heat to breed in order to survive. If we had always been so sexually obsessed, we would never have evolved to become intelligent animals. Just like if our pets were trusting enough in the wild to wag their tails, purr, and be pet without fear by other animals, they would have been made easy prey for other animals who hadn't forgotten their will to survive above all else. We forgot our survival when we began to control our environment to the extent that we could produce offspring successfully at any time of year. As this happened, we went into a season of heat that begins in puberty and ends when we are tired of keeping up with satisfying those urges, some at younger ages than others, while some never tire of sex even into their elderly years. So in some respects, sexuality is more like a mental disorder for everyone, heterosexuals and homosexuals. Like with any mental problem, if it doesn't cause problems for society if the person who hosts it doesn't make it so, which in this case can even become an asset to the host or simply ignored, then it isn't looked at as an illness like other mental weaknesses are. It's only when the carrier extends his or her obsessions outward into society in a destructive way that it requires social or governmental intervention. Sexuality is a mental disorder that most all humans carry while unwittingly pretending it to be normal. So the few amongst us who make it through the maze of awkward and desperate confusions this equation of ignorance causes get to be the winners of the delusions of sexuality game. In ancient times, much of the truth about sexuality was understood, as it was such an easy observation to make when seeing how animals went into seasonal heats while we stayed in heat all the time. Sex back then was a tool of relief for a mental weakness or strength, depending on how it was expressed. Then the Catholic Church romanticized sexuality and marriage. In spite of many cultural revolutions surrounding the topic of sex over the past few centuries, we still manage to hold on to these very destructive myths about the meaning of love and sex. As far as we think we've evolved in understanding sexuality over the last few generations, we're still hiding from ourselves the truth about why we never stopped wanting sex. This affects us socially in deep and very negative ways. When it comes to discussing the legitimacy of heterosexual sex over homosexual sex, neither one is actually true to our human nature. Neither one is truly real enough that one can claim to be the right way to deal with our domesticated evolution over the other. It's no different than how white-collar cocaine addicts who primarily snort their drugs look down on crackheads while the government gives out harsher sentences for crack violations than powdered cocaine. People who smoke pot look down on people who smoke PCP. People who drink look down on the illegal drug users altogether. People who get their drugs from a doctor think they're doing nothing wrong while the rest are breaking the law, which they are. But they all think what they do is okay. So it's politics that drives the issue, not a legitimate debate on how to manage the problem of addiction. So the problem never goes away, but only gets worse.